Well, everybody's favorite topic to discuss is always risk. Actually, not really, but risk is really important because in personal finance, we need to be able to identify risk and then develop strategies to whether it's mitigate it, avoid it, or maybe transfer it to another party, most likely an insurance company. So in this video, we're going to talk about risk in general, and we're also going to discuss some ways that you can manage risk. We can't eliminate risk entirely unless you wanted to avoid doing anything fun whatsoever. So because of that, we want to identify the risk first, but also look at ways to mitigate it, knowing that if we cross the street, there's some inherent risk. If we drive to work, there's some inherent risk. So to start us off, let's really focus on what risk is. So risk in its sense is just a chance of injury or loss. So really put in a simple way, it's the chance of something really bad happening, right? So in this case, a lot of times we have insurance that helps us to sort of transfer risk to another party, right? Those are all things that we do knowing that there's risk inherent in really doing just about everything. So risk, of course, is the result of what we call a peril. And perils really just represent anything that may possibly cause a loss. And so perils are really the start of bad things happening. So these are the cause of losses. And so when you think about the different types of risk, and I'm going to write out, and there's a fairly exhaustive list. We think about property risk is a risk that we have. We think about personal risk. There is liability risk. And we also have what we call speculative risk, which is not as common, but I'll give you an example of what that might look like. So these are all the different types of risks that we might incur, and some of these are pure risks, and many of these are insurable in some way, shape, or form. So when thinking about like property risk, right, there's a risk of property damage, and these are usually caused by perils. And so when you think about property, including your automobile or your home, right? There's a risk of getting into an auto accident. That would be a peril. There's a risk of your home being damaged in a fire, and the fire represents a peril. So the peril is the cause of the loss in this case. Risk can also be sort of created as a result of negligence. And negligence is really simply the failure to take reasonable precautions. So let's say, for example, that you have a vehicle and your vehicle is damaged in some way, shape, or form. Let's say it's vandalized, and so someone breaks your windshield or breaks your driver's side window and steals some items from your car. And then you leave your car outside, and you look at it, obviously report the loss, but then you leave your vehicle outside and it rains, and the rain causes a bunch of damage to your interior. Well, that would be an example of negligence, because the primary loss, which is the vandalism and then the theft, obviously is your initial loss to your personal property or to your property risk. However, you didn't make an attempt to mitigate the subsequent damage, which is, of course, the water damage to your interior. And so that is an element of negligence, right? We have to take reasonable precautions in order to try to mitigate as much risk as we possibly can. Very similar, you can look at maintenance of a vehicle, and if you don't properly maintain your vehicle, let's say your tires are very worn and you're driving on the freeway and you have a tire blowout and it causes an accident, right? So that liability can be on you because you had a duty to maintain your own vehicle, and so you're kind of deemed to be negligent in that regard. So all of these things are different risks that we incur. Now, when we talk about risk management, really we're not talking about eliminating risk 100%, because it's not possible to eliminate risk 100%. That would be fantastic, but frankly, that's not how it works. And we know that we can't just live under a rock or in a cave or something like that. we want to live life. And so by living life, we incur risks. And so we make these trade-offs, right? And things that we're okay with doing and things that we're not okay with doing, right? So are we okay with cliff diving? Maybe, maybe not. Are we okay with driving to work? Probably, and that's kind of a necessity. So when we talk about risk management, really we lump these into kind of 4 categories on things that we can do to try and eliminate, or not eliminate, but rather reduce our exposure to some of the different types of risk that are in this area here. So risk to our property, risk to kind of our own personal selves, risk of harming other people in terms of liability, and then speculative risk, which is this last one here. And this is really one that in many ways applies to businesses, that you're kind of speculative, meaning that you're not sure if you're going to be affected positively by something or negatively by something. And so we can insure ourselves for those differences. And so if you think about trading securities and purchasing stocks, right, you can purchase things called options and puts, which in many ways help you kind of reduce your speculative risk because they put like a ceiling or a floor rather on how much money you can lose, and you can exercise your option and blah, blah, blah. And that's really getting into the weeds a little bit, but just give you a little bit of a feel for what speculative risk looks like. But going back into how we manage risk, there are 4 primary ways that we can manage risk. So the first way that you can manage risk is by implementing what we call risk avoidance. And this is probably the most obvious thing that we can do. However, it's not practical all the time. So when we talk about avoiding risk or risk avoidance, really it is simply avoiding things that lead to risk, right? And so risk, again, is the chance of injury or loss. So if we want to avoid getting into a vehicle accident, we simply avoid driving vehicles. Now, you might think that sounds ridiculous, and that's probably the case, right? Especially depending upon where you live, and if your community isn't extremely walkable, you might think, well, it's not possible for me to avoid that entirely. But there maybe are things that you can avoid doing that would completely eliminate your risk. And so again, as individuals, we have to make those decisions and trade-offs to see, well, is the likelihood and the potential for risk, does that mean I shouldn't engage in an activity? And many people with regards to driving, right, the inherent risk is small relative to the gains of driving in a vehicle and the speed and the ease of commute and those sorts of things and the time savings. But that is one thing that you can do. If you are concerned about having, your personal property, stolen, right? You might not take it out, right? So if you're concerned about whether it's jewelry or things like that getting stolen, then you might not wear them, but then that kind of gets into why purchase it to begin with. So one way is completely just avoiding the risk altogether. The next thing that we can do is do what we call risk reduction. And this is where we get into some more practical things. So knowing that we can't avoid risk entirely, what we might gravitate towards is trying to reduce our risk as much as possible so that the potential for loss is very minimal. So an example of reducing risk would be if you are trying to reduce the risk of damage to your home, right? You can make sure and have certain fire alarm system and a sprinkler system, and make sure that your carbon monoxide and dioxide sensors are actually functioning correctly, right? If you're operating a motor vehicle, you can reduce your risk by driving the speed limit, by avoiding going through the intersection on a yellow, and all those other sorts of things, right? Signaling, that sort of thing. Those are ways that you can reduce your risk, right? Your possibility of the loss actually happening. You can even reduce your risk by wearing a seatbelt, right? So that way, if an accident does happen, your personal risk of injury is reduced quite a bit. because you have access to something that's going to restrain you. And so that's what you would move to is risk reduction. So far, we've all talked about things that we can do to minimize or avoid risk that we don't need anything, we don't need any help for, right? These are all under our control. Now, after these, assuming that we've tried to avoid all the risk we can and we've made our best attempt to reduce risk, well, then what we can do is we can engage in what's called risk shifting. And another word for this is risk transferring. They're used somewhat interchangeably, but in some language it's risk shifting, and some you see risk transferring. So risk shifting is where we, for the first time, we get insurance involved. And so we've tried to avoid risk as much as possible. We've tried to reduce it as much as we can through acting responsibly and those sorts of things. And now we know that we're going to have some risk. And so we want to shift that as much as possible. And so the way that this works is you would get an insurance policy, right? So if you drive an automobile, then you would have an automobile insurance policy, which would, in the event of an accident, shift the risk to the insurance company, so that they would actually help you cover certain damages. And that's where you get into collision coverage, comprehensive coverage, property damage coverage, all those different things, so that in the unfortunate event, if an accident were to take place, you would be able to transfer or shift that risk over to the insurance company. And then, of course, in exchange, you agree to pay them a certain premium on a monthly or annual basis for the right to shift that risk over to them if it ever comes to bear. Now, of course, on your end, you're kind of betting on the fact that that's going to happen, right? Which is why you carry insurance. And the insurance companies, of course, betting on that not taking place, so they can collect the premium, continue to invest said premiums, and then obviously don't have to pay anything out. But that ultimately is kind of the arrangement there. And so insurance is a great way to be able to shift risk, and then it helps us to minimize it in many ways. And with insurance policies, usually you have a deductible. And you can look at this also from your health insurance coverage, right? So the risk of personal injury is there, but if you have medical coverage, then you pay your deductible to go to the doctor, or you have your copay, or you have kind of your your maximum allowable amount, and then the insurance carrier helps to cover a portion of your medical expenses and those sorts of things. Now, one last way of dealing with risk, not necessarily minimizing it or anything like that, but dealing with risk is what we call risk assumption. And what risk assumption means is that we're simply going to take responsibility that something bad might happen. And that's as simple as that. And so we try to avoid it when we can, when it makes sense. We try and reduce it as much as possible. We can shift the risk to an insurance company, but ultimately there's going to be some risks that we frankly are just okay with happening. And so we are going to make the decision that we can drive to work and we can go on an airplane and those sorts of things. And we're going to assume some of the risk for ourselves. Taken to more an extreme end, risk assumption, you can get into what we call like self-insurance, which means you're going to cover yourself. But in many ways, risk assumption is just the acknowledgement of the fact that I am going to incur some kind of risk. I've made the calculation, I've done the math, and I feel like the risk potential is not greater than the benefit of engaging in the activity whatsoever. So an example could be going to the lake. You have a boat, you're going to take some friends out. There is, of course, risk in that, and you could be held liable or negligent if the boat isn't maintained. If you're driving it and somebody gets injured, right? There are some risk factors involved. And so I'm not saying don't do those things, but look at how do we manage that situation? How can I avoid risk? Well, I can make sure and maintain a safe distance. I can use the flags if somebody's in the water. I can make sure that people are acting responsibly while in the boat, those sorts of things. That's how I can kind of reduce my risk, let's say. I can shift risk by having insurance coverage and that sort of thing that protects the boat and protects the people that are in it. But at the end of the day, I'm going to assume some element of risk because of the fact that I'm going to engage in the activity. And the or the potential for fun is greater than the negative effect and the probability of those things actually happening. So again, part of risk management isn't necessarily trying to eliminate risk entirely, but it's one, identifying where the risk is and then having a plan to address it, whether it's avoiding, reduction, shifting, or at the end of the day, simply assuming that I'm going to have that risk.